What is up, theology nerds? Today on the podcast, we're looking at the history of religion in America with one of the preeminent historians, Grant Wacker. And he gives this proposition that I found fascinating. He calls it the Bushman test, inspired by the historian Richard Bushman. He said, when looking back in time, trying to capture the life, times, thought, and wrestling of a figure, you want to write the history knowing that someday you might just be hanging out with them in heaven. That kind of critical yet sympathetic and understanding framework is something historians work for. And in this conversation, Grant talks about how that animated his own book, an amazing book on the life of Billy Graham. But more than that, I messaged him and said, hey, I'm wanting to talk to historians about the story of religion in America as we get near our 250th anniversary. And he came up with 10 defining moments in American religion. And actually, there were 11, but you get the point. This is a legendary historian taking the time to reflect and think about the different movements, energies, and patterns of religion here in America, and he unpacks them and shares this with us, and man, it is awesome. So, I know all you historian nerds are gonna be pumped to hear this, but any of you thinking about the nature of religion in America, it is a great thing to get to know where we came from and what in knowing our past can shape where we're going. I had a blast talking with Dr. Wacker, and I hope you do too. Remember, the best brew is a shared brew. So go send this episode to one of your friends who you think will benefit from it, and maybe it will inspire a zesty conversation between you two. Enjoy.
Okay, I'm Grant Wacker, and I taught at University of North Carolina and then at Duke, and I retired, Duke Divinity School, and retired 5 years ago. I live in Cary, North Carolina, and I used to teach American religious history, and that is in university, and the Divinity School is called American Christian History, and that was an appropriate change in nomenclature. So that's about all that's relevant, I think. So let me pick up that question of religion in history, because I have been thinking about that. And I do think that religion is never a causal force in great historical events. And that'll come as a surprise, I think, to a lot of church historians. But I just don't see that. What it is a contributing force. It's part of a larger complex of issues. And we look at economic pressures and say the structuring by gender or whatever. And it's part of that larger package. I think that in very specific situations, very tightly defined situations, we can see religion perhaps as a primary agent, but almost always just at the neighborhood level, but not in the broad sweep of things. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important. As a dimension of history, it's critically important for us to find it and to think about what it is and how it works and how it influences people.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the surprise some historians of religion may have of not giving religion as a significant, a causal role. Could you kind of say a bit about maybe what might be normative in thinking about religion's role, and why, as a historian throughout your career, you came to kind of resist giving it the causal imports that peers may have?
Yeah, thank you. I can't think of any instance in which I can isolate religion as a sole agent. And as I say, in a few very circumscribed situations, we might see it as a primary agent, but that's the most. Because look at in Civil War, let's say, for example, I mean, there's just so much else going on. Now, religion is certainly a part of the Civil War in lots of different ways, but to find it as the primary and certainly as a exclusive cause, I can't see that. And it's not a loss, really. I mean, just to find it there at all is pretty significant. So what I would say is that just as economic historians find the economic dimension of history, women's historians, feminist historians find the role of gender in history, religious historians should do the same.
Mm-hmm. It is, I know for people that had church history class, there's always that gap between once City of God's published to the Reformation. And then when it gets to introducing the Reformation, a lot of times that's one of the places that most people have thought about the different factors that set something up, be it the early emergence of the middle class around Luther's time, the political tensions that are rising around the formation of early nation states, early capitalism, the printing press, where there are all these factors going on, and along with how they connected to, I don't know, maybe the fuel for the Protestant kind of insight taking over. In a moment like that, like how as a historian do you start to think about the different causal factors that lead to this movement that transforms the history of the West?
Okay. Well, I'd be disingenuous if I said self-interest is not part of it. I mean, after all, it's my occupation. And if it had no role, then I would have no job. Okay. So self-interest is a part. We want to find something out there that corresponds to our training. But I think there's more to it than that. And your question, your wonderful question, prompted me to think more deeply about it. And I think there's several issues. One is simple curiosity. You know, we're curious people. It's hardwired into the human brain that most of us anyway are curious about what is going on and what has gone on. What has gone on is probably less important than what is going on now. But still, curiosity. I think that part of curiosity is a quest for a fuller story, the whole story. If you simply say, well, the Reformation was caused by the invention of the printing press. Well, yeah, it certainly is part of it. But before long, you know, you got to ask, well, surely there's more going on. And so we're drawn into the religious dimension because of the desire to find a fuller story. And then I get into sort of my theological side is that I look for a part of the story that illumines who I am. Now, you don't have to be a Christian to say this at all. I mean, anybody can say this, but it comes out of, for me, it comes out of Christian faith is that I would like to find a story that helps me understand, you know, basically what a miserable creature I am. Once in a while, I have some higher aspirations, but you know, who I am. And then there's something else your question prompted me to think about, and that is, I think Christian history or the study of Christian history, I'm conflating religion and history here. I'm conflating religion and Christianity now in the American story. Okay. I think it helps us separate what's important from what's interesting. An awful lot of things are interesting, and not a lot of things are important. And, you know, my work with Billy Graham brought that to the fore. Mr. Graham loved meringue lemon pie. He had a problem with insomnia. He chewed his fingernails. These are all kind of interesting features of his life. I don't think they were very important. Now, maybe we can find, if we play with it, we can maybe find insomnia had some larger ramifications. But in general, it seems to me that the quest for Christian history helps us separate what's truly important from what's merely interesting. So all those things go together in, you know, and in creating a motive for finding the religious dimension in history and the Christian dimension. I think those are pretty important at the end of the day.
You know, the first book of yours I read was the one on Augustus Strong and kind of historical consciousness and the way that shaped kind of religious consciousness in America. One of the things that it made me think of, and I haven't got to ask a historian this, is how that plays out in theological education. As a theologian, a lot of times I would have the Bible professors tell their students that are having a lot of trouble, right, when they meet historical criticism in their intro to the Hebrew Bible class. Like, Moses didn't write this? I didn't know this. You're ruining Sunday school for me. They get JDP, Q source in the New Testament, debates about miracle stories, all these kinds of things. And the experience for so many of those students is this is the kind of like thrown in the deep end of historical consciousness. And now these texts, traditions, and stories take on a whole new valence. And, you know, how you understand the world metaphysically, how you understand something like divine action or anything like that, or different causal powers and narrating any history will change how you think theologically with these texts from the early church and from the people of Israel. And, you know, that's its own battle. And theologians end up having to do this kind of stuff in hermeneutics around the text. But it seems to me a lot of times but that engagement in biblical studies isn't followed by a church history where we tell the history of the church, and the at what point do we ascribe the presence of the Spirit involved in any of it? Oftentimes, within the academy, our Bible and our history classes give more prominence to kind of a rather flattened historical account, one in which there isn't a living and life-giving God active, where you don't tell the story of the church as if
Yep.
there's a living and life-giving God that's a
Right.
part of, all that's going on. And so I wonder how, as a historian that also has a deep faith, how you relate to that tension in any account of history. I know that you used the line talking about a primitive and pragmatic framework for thinking about it that I found helpful.
Yeah. Well, first, I congratulate you for reading that book. The only other person who ever read any part of it was my wife, and she only got through the first chapter. And she said she's sure that the rest of it must be important. But let's say that book was sales challenged, okay? And it did not show up at Walgreens, but it was important to me. Like a lot of doctoral dissertation, it grew out of a dissertation. And like a lot of dissertations in religion, it's autobiographical. And I hinted at that in the introduction. I was trying to deal with some issues that were important to me. And then at the rate of immodesty over the years, I've always been surprised by what has happened is that every now and then, not every day, but every now and then I'll get an email from some pastor somewhere who says, I read that book and that helped me. And it isn't because the book itself is so great, but the issue itself of historical consciousness, role of history and faith, how these things come together. I mean, those issues endure. And I settled upon Augustus Strong as just one of three. I was also looking at E.Y. Mullins and William Rainey Harper. And then I got to 300 pages and my advisor said, that's enough. Okay. So we quit with Strong. But there are a lot of people who have wrestled, with that problem. And I think, Tripp, that the key word there is wrestle. I don't see that there are some really clear, easy answers. We wrestle with a lot of things in life. And this is just one of the things that we need to try to put together. My faith is part of me. My critical sense is part of me. And they're both part of me. And so we put them together as best we can. Now, let me go to the pedagogical educational question you raised. And that is, when I went to college, I went to a secular college. I grew up in a hardcore fundamentalist Pentecostal home. I mean, it was hardcore. So I go to a secular college, and I remember the first week in Western Civ, we were reading a book by H.B. Parks called Gods and Men. Okay, I still remember that. And he talked about the legends of Genesis. And it was like I was hit with a sandbag. Well, what do you mean, legends of Genesis? I mean, this is true. There's no legends here, all right? Well, you find out soon enough. There were legends, and you have to deal with that in college. And so that was, in a sense, a driving motivation to come to terms with that kind of, confrontation that you get in a secular school. And so this is part of it. I think that and it's not just kids coming from fundamentalist schools, homes and going into secular colleges. I mean, teaching my students at Duke Divinity School, a lot of them are very sophisticated backgrounds. And I began to talk about the historical development of systems and ideals and principles that they hold dear. And they get very uncomfortable. They don't want to think that something developed over time, historically, in response to social pressures, right? They want to think that somehow these are all sacred meteors that, tumble down. And so it's not a problem simply of a Bible Institute. Rather, it's a more common problem. And so what we have to help students do, I think, is find faith, not in spite of, but through trying to see how God interacted in history, historical process.
Yeah, you gave a little example when you were talking about that dynamic or the framework of a primitive and pragmatic approach or the primitive is like the heavenly focused and the pragmatic, the earthly, creating a kind of productive tension. And this is, I think, when you were talking about kind of looking at Pentecostal history, and you mentioned Richard Bushman's heaven test, where you're treating historical subjects as if someday we'll meet them, and meet the people we write about in heaven. I had never thought of it, but it is a very fun way of thinking about it, because in my experience, when I read a whole lot of individuals and I'm working on something, I'll have vivid dreams where I hang out with them and talk,
Yeah.
which can sometimes make me confident in my
Well, I'm
interpretations of
sorry.
them.
I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, I wish you'd dream more about basketball and other, more.
Well, see, I didn't go to Duke. I went to Wake Forest, so
Oh, okay.
we wait 10 years. Every 10 years we get to have a run.
Gotcha. Well, Richard Bushman's one of my favorite people. I have some heroes. Martin Marty was one, and he's now left us. And Richard is, I think he's 93, 94, and is a devout Mormon, and is, a historian of Mormonism and also Mormon himself. And he's reflected on these issues deeply. And one of the things I like about Richard a lot is he's also a historian of a lot of other things. He's written books about bathing, for example, and such, the American Revolution. So he writes about things that are not just religious. But when he is writing about religion, as a Mormon, I think he's very sensitive in a good way. He's sensitive to the way that groups like Mormons are so easily disparaged in the academy. And basically he's saying, let's bring it on for one thing, and then let's talk about it. And one of his principles there is just that one, is just simple honesty. Be honest with your subjects and give them the first shake. Now, you don't have to ultimately agree with them. And I don't agree with Richard on all of his theological views by any means. But what I do agree with is that the subjects should have the first word. And then there's something else. And I take this from another former colleague, Tom Tweed. Tom now teaches at Notre Dame. And Tom's response, not directly to Richard, but his response to that issue is that if you give them the first word, then you have the second word, but you need to let them hear your second word and see if they recognize themselves in that construction. And if they say, I have no, that's entirely alien, that has no reference at all to what I really am trying to say, then we need to go back to work on that. Still, they don't get the final word, but at least it should be a process of negotiation. So that's what I was trying to say, is that I think we owe our subjects this kind of respect. And when we do that, it often turns out that our subjects usually have reasons for why they did what they did. And even when we don't like those people, and I don't like their theology, if we let them talk, before long, at least usually we can see there's a reason. I'm 80 years old, okay, and in my 8 decades on this planet, I don't think I can name many people who say, really, I'm just a dummy and I have no idea why I did what I did. I mean, yeah, occasionally people say that in jest. They don't very often say that about themselves. I just cannot even begin to explain my behavior. Usually you press them and they can't explain it.
Yeah, one of the things that I find interesting and maybe daunting the moment I started thinking about how you would do this as a historian is, if you begin with a kind of count where you're wanting them to know that they've been known and how you're articulating them, right?
Great point. Yeah.
And where theologically would say we're trying not to bear false witness against the past.
I'm
right?
going to write that down. I like that point. They want them to know that they have been known.
So I see that element, and then there's this bit of all in the 19th and 20th century, the kind of eruption of different theorists that think about false consciousness, like the ways in which we aren't transparent to ourselves about what the animating forces are. Like I sometimes joke in philosophy of religion class with students that it could be that I spent all this time in graduate school studying philosophy, religion, and science, and articulating the viability of a Christian articulation of the world, and I'm seeking after the truth, or maybe I have mom issues and I don't know it, and she would be so disappointed if I was like, yeah, this doesn't really hold muster, and that might have been true at certain points and not at other points, and we're just not always transparent. And so, like, one of the gifts I think of historians is both the kind of vocational investment and understanding the story as the figures in history would tell it themselves, and then looking at it in a broader context and talking threads, like that was one of the things I really enjoyed about your work on Billy Graham as the side of Baptists that his tribe excommunicated and such. Yeah, I came in with a certain kind of suspicion, and I could have quoted and mentioned references in early Graham on race where he said stuff that's just embarrassing and things like that. And you tell the story because you got to know him and tell it well, where you see an evolution in his thought and is more charitable than progressive Baptists who that see him as one of the figureheads, right? That alienated them from so many of the people they grew up.
Well, that's another question you raise, and that is what happens when you actually meet someone that you're writing about. Now, you don't have that privilege most of the time. I mean, well, maybe you are in touch with him, but maybe that's not a story you want to hear about right now.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, my dreams with Luther in them are very interesting. He's always on the toilet.
Yeah. But actually, when I was working on Graham, actually, the friend I mentioned, Skip Stout, said, don't do it. Don't meet him personally. And so Skip had just finished writing about Jonathan Edwards. And really, if you had a chance to have coffee with Jonathan Edwards, I mean, would you give it up? And he said, no. Well, okay. I mean, when it comes down to it, in theory, you can say that if you meet the person you're writing about, it might defang you in certain ways. But I think it also opens up dimensions. And what meeting Graham did, and I should say my wife went with me, and one of the things I found there is he was more interested in her than he was in me, the old Southern gentleman. And that's an important dimension of his life, is that, protocol mattered. But anyway, what I found is one sense of humor, and the self-deprecating sense of humor, which you see in the sermons, and sometimes reporters will say, "Oh, well, this is just cooked for the purpose." To some extent, that's true, but it also it's natural. The self-deprecating humor came very naturally. But what I also saw was a deep humility, and it was genuine. But at the same time, Tripp, it was not only was there a deep humility, but there was also an awareness that he knew who he was. He knew he was Billy Graham. And I've heard Rick Lisher say this about Martin Luther King as well. He knew who he was. It took time, both cases. It didn't dawn overnight, but a consciousness developed, awareness of themselves as being more than themselves. He understood, I'm talking about Graham now, he understood that he was a symbol, and that he understood that he exercised tremendous power. He knew that. He could open up doors, he could close doors. Well, how do you put all that together? An awareness of your human finitude with an awareness of your power. And that's what drew me to him, and I think what draws us to very often biographical figures.
Mm-hmm. In our email exchanges before the interview, I mentioned doing a series looking at the coming anniversary of the country and finding it interesting to find out what historians think about the story of religion in America. And you mentioned that you had 11, not 10,
11.
not 12, kind of moments in American religious history that kind of have enduring shaping power and such. So I'd love to hear them. Maybe we could do them in order, and both what they are, but also as someone who's spent a whole career wrestling with telling this story each year to students and then doing research and all these different parts of it, the understanding your selection process and what maybe people that aren't as familiar with the history of religion in America, why you chose these as spaces to pause.
Well, I want to tell you that I didn't choose 11. There were 11. So I just told the truth. I mean, it was Ken Casey said about his writing about Hell's Angels in Oakland. He said, well, he asked one of the Hell's Angels leaders, how do you select other Hell's Angels? And he said, we don't select them. We recognize them. And so that's what I'm teasing you about. Yeah, you got me thinking about this, and I would separate the 11 from a preceding 4. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The preceding 4 is that I think I would make an argument that there are 4 great, powerful forces in American history, and religion fits into them. And there are a lot of other ways to cook these books, but it strikes me that this is a useful way. And I'm thinking about the great, powerful forces, and the first one is that we don't often think about is the power of the physical environment. And when I back in the days when I was teaching, I tried to invite students to think about the physical environment in the United States. And what this means is, number one, our coastlines, our great river systems, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the plenitude of arable land. There are just so many features of the continental United States that are unique to the United States and make possible what historian David Potter called a people of plenty. We have not faced, say, recurrent cataclysmic events like, say, Pakistan has. We have been the beneficiaries of a physical environment that's been, this is salubrious. Okay, that's one. And I think a second, and not in any particular order here, a second is what I would call either the Puritan or capitalist impulse. And this is an impulse that focuses upon individual ability, and what also isn't often, I think, enough recognized is not only individual ability, but time management. Time counts, and how you spend your time counts. And this is a great legacy of the Puritans, is that individual effort and time management, and it's designed toward an end. It's purposeful. So that's a part of our history that is not in, shall we say, great vogue now, but it's there. Then a third part of our history, obviously, is oppression, and particularly of Native American and Black populations by white populations. And this has so many dimensions. But the role of oppression, slavery, the decimation of Native populations, I mean, so many ramifications there. But that's there, and we can never overlook it. And it has, enduring ramifications for our lives today. Then the fourth one is immigration. And by immigration, I mean this in a common sense term. I mean, you can finesse that, but I mean, just saying the common sense meaning of it, waves and waves of people coming in the 19th century, first from Asia, for Eastern Europe, and then in greater numbers from Asia. And so these people who were coming were different from the so-called host culture. And that difference mattered, and how we came to terms with that difference. So the physical environment, the capitalist impulse, and oppression, immigration. So I think these are four really powerful forces that shape us. Okay. Now, what about religion? This is really going to be debatable. You just throw it out. And here's my 11 trip, is that they're not necessarily in order of importance, but they're not. I'll just say it that way. Would have to think about the order of importance, but the order that come to my mind is, number one, an expansionist impulse, which produced colonization. We are the products Americans, we're the products of French, Spanish, British, Portuguese colonization, and the slave trade. This is all part of an awareness of economic possibilities, and of course, race. So an expansionist impulse is just embedded in American religion. All right. A second would be a subjection of Native Americans. What terms we may use: subjection, in many cases, the virtual annihilation. And very closely related to that then would be slavery, enslavement, and the enduring ramifications of enslavement. So that would be a third. A fourth would be the power of the Enlightenment. You and I today are conversing because of the Enlightenment. The technology that grew from it, but also our emphasis upon linear reasoning, dialogue, listening to each other, learning from all of this. There was a great historian at Cornell, Carl Becker, back in the 1930s, and great line from him. And he said, "We are so much the products of the Enlightenment, we cannot think any other way."
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it amazing? I mean, it's great.
Yeah.
I mean, we use the terms of the Enlightenment in order to critique it. Okay. And then I would say, I don't know where we are, 4 or 5 would be the creation of the American Republic. This grew from the Enlightenment. And the Revolutionary War is an artifact. That's a smaller matter. I'm thinking of the American Republic in a much larger sense of what we think of as the free church tradition. And the opportunity to think freely, more or less anyway, about who we are and what we are. War, and particularly the Civil War, and also World War II. But the role of war as a crucial one in forming American religion. 7, reform. And I think of reform in multiple ways. The underlying feature, the commonality in reform is a conviction that life can be better. It doesn't have to be the way it is. And so we have structural reform, personal reform, awareness of gender, which we didn't used to have, all these ways of thinking, well, life can be better. 8, I have to tell you, since I'm a Methodist, a Wesleyan, this is a big stretch for me, Reformed theology. As much as I would like to say it, I don't think Wesleyanism has had the power that Reformed, and for that matter, I don't think the Lutheran tradition either. The Reformed tradition has had this extraordinary power because it has given us a constant move to externalize, or use the jargon nowadays, to out ourselves. And it's embedded in the Reformed tradition. It's outing ourselves, externalizing, looking out. All right. 9, something that I don't know much about personally, the landscaping of religion, architecture, steeples. We see it everywhere, especially in the South, but not just in the South. We see it. There are visual reminders of our religious heritage. 10, the aural, A-U-R-A-L. And what's important to me about the hymnal tradition is its nostalgic factor, is that it reminds us of who we are. I left Pentecostalism many, many years ago, but when I hear those songs, I still tear up. And so the visual and the aural. And then lastly, this is number 11, renewal movements like the charismatic movement. And even outside the Christian tradition, not even, but outside the Christian tradition, there are renewal movements as well. And again, this is a sense that we can change. That's very American.
Mm-hmm.
Change.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome. Those are some great examples.
Wait, I want to make sure my wife heard that. Awesome. All right. You got that? All right.
And even Paul wanted to hear all 11.
Okay.
I told him if he could control his bowel movements, it might make more sense. But
all right.
It's hard for him to come listen to a podcast and not poop on my floor.
I guess so.
So you mentioned before we started recording that you are recently finishing up a project on colonial religion. And so I wonder, given how that period of time, there's little bitty nuggets probably covered in nostalgia that most people know about, but the intricacies and diversity of colonial religion and stuff is rarely comprehended at the larger, in the larger conversation in the country. That if people are thinking, on the, getting nostalgic on the anniversary of the country and thinking about those early days, are there particular features or stories or moments or tensions that would really help people, kind of get in touch with the beginning of the kind of Western story of religion in America?
Well, thank you. I mean, briefly, yeah. I mean, on the negative side, there are atrocities, and I just cannot get beyond what basically white civilization did to the native civilization and enslavement, and it's just so important just to keep that front and center, the reality of the atrocities that we not only have to redress but repent for. And so that's that. But on a positive side, I would say 2. One would be the sheer power of the Puritan impulse to look inward and to reform ourselves. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're still, people, historians my age, my generation, we're all students of Perry Miller. And actually, the first volume of Perry Miller is the New England Mind, and that a relentless sense of self-examination of, can we do better? Are we the people that we should be? And of course, that can get off the rails in so many ways, but it's an invigorating message. And then third is the Enlightenment and the way that has changed our world. And in Duke Divinity School, the Enlightenment does not have a very good name nowadays. But I think if they probed it, they would see the very terms that we use to critique the Enlightenment come out of it. And that the respect for linear rationality. So those are three things: the negative side and the positive, the rigor of Puritanism. Maybe one other thing, as long as you invited me, is that, and again, I get this from my work with Puritans, and that is the value placed upon the family. And that not necessarily, I mean, for them, it was the nuclear family, but I would say for us, we should understand family as a sense of the networks of trust. Who do we trust? Who do we listen to? My colleague or counterpart over at UNC, Molly Worthen, has written this wonderful book on charisma. And part of how she defines charisma is these are the people we listen to. Well, who do we listen to? And Puritans, and I think for so many others in our history, we have certain criteria about who we listen to. I listen to you today. I respect, your credentials and the way you approach me. And so I listen to you and you're listening to me. And so there's certain people that constitute family. And I think we get that from our beginnings.
A lot of times the only piece of colonial religion people get to read is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God from Edwards. Occasionally, maybe some exchanges between like Puritans having a battle with Roger Williams. These kind of things might show up in a English literature class type thing. But if we were to take that task of describing the shape of Puritan faith in ways they would hear it and recognize themselves in it, and not just, kind of moralizing the differences between their time and ours. What do you learn about Puritan vision of faith when we let them be in their time? What could help us get a generous understanding?
For a philosopher, you know an awful lot about American church history, I will say. I wish I knew half as much about philosophy as you do about American history. But I would say one word. I always on the one word: accountability. What the Puritan tradition has left us is a sense of accountability, first to God, and that's been eclipsed in our secular culture, but still accountability to God. But even if you don't want to be theistic about it, accountability to each other and to ourselves, and that time counts. The way we live our lives matter. These things matter. Your question about the early years prompts me to think that there's a lot in those early years that not only informs us, but should form us. As Catholics and Lutherans use that term, Pentecostals don't, but that's a really important distinction. Education, informing, also forming. And how do we come to greater wisdom? Not just education, but how do we come to greater wisdom about ourselves and who we are? And as Christians, I say, in our relationship with God, but also our relationships with each other.
One of the things I really enjoyed in Heaven Below, which is Grant's book on early Pentecostals, is that you're telling that story and telling the story of American culture at that time. And in it, you're looking at the emergence of Pentecostalism, but there are also all the historical and cultural factors that enable it or make it possible, and kind of made it be able to catch on with a kind of energy that in the present, at least in my experience, is going back in time and seeing the larger kind of cultural situation in America made the story of Pentecostalism make more sense, compared to someone that grew up in Reformed Baptist home, where anything that lively is already uncomfortable, and needing a second baptism is just problematizing God's sovereignty. So I really enjoyed the book for that purpose. But I'd love for you to kind of, as someone that spent time there, help connect those dots of, as a historian, when you're trying to tell the birth of Pentecostalism here in America, why what's going on writ large in culture at that time helps give a thick account.
I will give a very quick answer, and it seems to trivialize a profound question, but I don't mean for it. It's a way of getting into the question. The sewing machine. Okay. What is the sewing machine? It's a device for people who want to fix their clothes at home. They want to take control of their own lives. It's self-help. And it's the culture of self-help that drives the Pentecostal movement, I think. And it's a high anthropology. This is something we can do. We're not lost. We can take control of our lives. We can grab hold and we can make ourselves into new people. And in this case, for Pentecostals, spirit-filled people, we can become vessels for the Holy Spirit. And this empowers us, but there's this pervasive sense of empowerment, and actually goes back to self-help. And I think that's what we see today. The consumer culture, prosperity gospel is just a small part of it. The sense that we have control, we can take control, and accountability should be there, but it isn't always. So that strikes me as at the very core of the culture that empowered early Pentecostals. Second thing was empowerment of women. And women have always been present, and they've always had a role. But in the Pentecostal movement, they began to have a role that is, I would say, almost unprecedented. Now, this does not mean that they were ordained. They were not. And it's misleading to say, oh, well, early Pentecostals ordained women. They very rarely did. Amy McPherson was an extreme exception to this. But having said that, what we do find is women moving to the front in a way that we actually have that Roman Catholic tradition with nuns, that nuns have this formative influence that is, I don't think, has gotten enough recognition. And that's true of Pentecostals. And then if you look, this is a long answer to a short question. Pentecostalism is important because of what happened to it after World War II. It is not intrinsically important. It just bumbled along. It's a very small movement until the 1950s. We probably wouldn't even be talking about it. If the 1950s had never existed, I think we'd be talking about it. But it's in the 1950s that it begins to move outward geographically, and especially in the 60s. And then it catches fire in the so-called third world, developing world, the majority world. All these terms have now come to us. And what has happened in the majority world is that Pentecostalism has enabled indigenous leadership. And we like to think, oh, well, missionaries started all this. Well, they may have taken a spark over there, but that's all. These movements are indigenous, and they have grown because of internal forces, but to good extent, from what I know of, it's because native leaders, indigenous leaders, were empowered by the Pentecostal message, and they weren't dependent upon government structures. They weren't dependent upon mainline structures. They were fired by something else.
Yeah, there's always a difficulty, especially for more mainline Protestants, in understanding Pentecostalism in their neighbor, let alone just how it functions globally. But there's a couple threads in your description, going back to like the sewing machine and this kind of self-help, or with a more positive look at the human being, a higher anthropology, and looking at how we can do this more effectively or efficiently, gifts in the spiritual realm, as opposed to, well, those of us that like to reflect on our depravity on a too often basis.
Okay.
That seems like there are big connections there between that Puritan capitalist impulse you mentioned earlier, of around the individuals having ability, and now a greater ability, or the kind of time management and such of being intentional, responsible, and deliberate, right, with your agency, and that in some ways it gives a theological imagination for God being intentional, deliberate, and responsive about divine agency. So
Right.
the presence of the divine is imminently palpable of sorts, in ways that make the Reformed tradition blush.
Yeah, you're right, absolutely. Now, can I interrupt here quickly? It's your tradition that is what's lacking in the Pentecostal, and we need each other. The Pentecostal, I say we, that's what I grew up in. Pentecostal tradition is triumphalist. Lutherans have brought a realist sensibility that, after all, we are broken. And triumphalism left alone can actually make things worse. And the two traditions need each other. And I find that in a healthy Wesleyanism does that. It has a healthy sense of the possibility, of human possibility, but it also retains, John Wesley had a rich sense of sin too, that not every mainline Wesleyan church has maintained that sense of human finitude, sin, selfishness, brokenness.
Yeah, one of my best friends, Bo, he's a practical theologian, but Methodist clergy, when he got reassigned recently, the church was like, "Oh, we want to learn more about our Methodist and Wesleyan heritage," and so he got up and read the methods to them and said, "Y'all want to try any of these together?" And they looked at him and said, "Nope." and
So
it's interesting just how, when you're looking at maybe the ideal type of any of the kind of diversity of religious
right.
traditions in America, they're there, and then there's American religion writ large. I don't know how you would describe it, but there are just certain features that religious people in America share in common, even if their clergy are hardcore into whatever
Right.
type they are.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's like he said, when I was teaching, I had a Lutheran bishop complain that a bunch of she was working with a congregation and they just wanted to get together and have a vote on it. And and, and I said, see, everyone's a little Baptist deep down.
Yeah, deep down. Yeah. My daughter is a Methodist minister and she quips. It is a quip. She says she spends half her time trying to explain to Methodists that they aren't Baptists. And, underlying point is that all Americans are Baptists, really. They all think that they can choose. And Methodists have a really hard time with polity, understanding a connectional, structured polity. Yeah. So, but going back to Wesley, two of the pieces of Wesley that I used to tell students about was his common sense. And number one, he said, if you're suffering from insomnia, get up 1 hour earlier tomorrow. And if that doesn't work, then the next day, get up another hour earlier and see what happens. That was one. And then another case is a woman complained to him about fleshiness. And he said, well, stop eating butter. Okay. So, things that are just, that common sense, I think, it has a larger ramification in that theology in the churches. It needs to touch ground too, where people really live.
Yeah.
Part of our faith. Yeah.
And this is about, you mentioned the renewal movements being that 11th feature of when you were looking at these 11 elements of American religion. And when you think of the American revivalism, the Great Awakenings, the Pentecostal movement, these kinds of things, and you've looked at, Whitefield and Moody and Graham, Billy Sunday and such, what has been the different shifts theologically or methodological shifts in American revivalism when you look at those early days all the way to the present? In part because I think there's both a larger disengagement of religion in the present and an increasing awareness that culture writ large doesn't handle questions of meaning and significance as well. And so religious figures are like, what can we learn from looking at these movement and the energy of revival in American church history?
Well, wonderful question. And to put this in theological terms, I think there has been a general movement from Reformed Lutherans, say Reformed/Lutheran sensibility to an Arminian sensibility and more common sense, a growing sense of our autonomy as people. And it's a different anthropology that we're masters of our own fate. And I think that is a key feature. And one of the features about Billy Graham that I try to stress is the frequency of both the concept and the term decision. His radio program, Hour of Decision. His TV program, Hour of Decision. His magazine, one word, decision. And he himself said that every one of his sermons ultimately was about John 3:16. Decide. Decide for the gospel. Christ has made the gospel available. You decide. It's up to you to take it. All right. And all of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of pictures of Billy Graham that I haven't seen hundreds of thousands, but in the thousands that I saw, I only saw one picture of him in which he lost his composure, and that is when he's emerging from a tour of Auschwitz. Otherwise, you never see a photo of Graham losing his composure. There are no tears. There's very little emotion in general, but there's no tears. What it is, it's decision. Take hold of the gospel. And so I think that that's part of the broader change that has taken place, and it's a salutary one. As long as we're aware that, we don't control our lives totally, but taking hold of responsibility, that's part of it. The second seems what it does not exist in, say, Jonathan Edwards' day, but does exist today, is the both entrepreneurialism and the possibilities that entrepreneurialism can exploit, particularly with technology. Reporters would ask me, well, what's the key difference between Billy Graham and Billy Sunday? And again, it's one word, airplanes. A lot of this is just one word. I wonder if Billy Sunday wouldn't have been a Billy Graham if he had access to airplanes. So he didn't. And Billy Graham's all over the world. He lives in airplanes. The mobility, the technology makes possible what we're doing today, the internet. It's just a whole other universe that was not available to a Billy Sunday. And so it's just qualitatively different today. So those are two big changes: the movement toward an Arminianism and the possibilities that an entrepreneurial sense make possible. The way we can exploit possibilities today that they were not before, even the computer,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely think that the technology feature is kind of wild, right? Like the idea that how many churches would have more than 5 people in it that would like for you and I to talk for an hour and a half and listen to it. Not many churches, but because of the internet, there'll be 80,000 people that are that one or two persons at different churches across the country listen to us talk. And so the technology bit is always changing just what communication looks like, and also how niche a market can be. Normally you have to go to school.
Yeah. A factoid that by itself is small, but it illumines a larger landscape. One of the reasons Roberts University flourished is, founded by a Pentecostal off in the middle of the Midwest, and here now it's a flourishing school with a medical school, a strong basketball team, et cetera. Okay. One of the reasons is because, if not Roberts himself, one of the people he delegated understood the power of targeted financial raising, made possible by the computer. They didn't just rely on the mass of Americans to fund them. What they relied on is the ability to target interests. And so they were able to find out who was interested in funding basketball. Now, that seems like an extremely small factoid, and in a way it is, but it's not, because what it illumines is how technology, in this case computerized targeting of finances, made an entire ball team possible, made a university possible, made other things. So in so many ways, technology has changed our world. And I don't know. Let me ask you a question. I mean, do you think the computer revolution is comparable to the printing press?
Yeah, I think it will end up being, especially when you think of the ultimate transformations AI is sending to all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But unlike the printing press, our current lack of regulation around AI has a few companies who have learned how to use AI first in advertising and then the military. And our inability to regulate and make a conscious decision of how the new technology is going to impact and shape our life together makes me more worried. Because when you think of just if you track sociographic metrics of well-being, the more time you spend on a device that basically gets to know you and uses an algorithm to generate income and attention by telling you what your insufficiencies are or what you need.
Why?
That is a feature one of your former colleagues at Duke, Norman, and I talked about earlier this year, about as long as you're on these platforms that organize what you see and hold your attention with AI, the impact of it is much like a plantation in the past. It generates servitude and it monetizes your kind of existential register. And that I think should be something we process theologically as people of faith, or just human beings wanting to live an intentional and deliberate life. How much of your attention do you want determined by an algorithm with an economic output with little interest in the social fabric and well-being? I think the experiment we're running isn't good for our kids or our democracy, and not our religion. So,
And you mentioned Norm. I didn't know you knew Norm or interviewed him, but I mean, the way Norm has opened so many of us to understanding the theological dimensions of what we eat, what we plant, whole worlds of existence that I grew up knowing nothing about, actually, until I met Norm, But I mean, and his colleague, my former colleague, Alan Davis, this is all in the Bible too. But especially with Norm, just this whole awareness that did not exist not very long ago.
Yeah, and Duke lucked out to get Kevin Hart, who a kind of philosopher and theologian, and one of his recent books on contemplation, kind of a philosophical analysis of contemplation, contrast what kind of historic wisdom traditions, how they've taught us the art of contemplation versus what contemporary technology is doing, which is mainly fascination. And it holds you fascinated, and we kind of are atrophying that mode of attention that you get in contemplative practice or sacred reading, those kind of things.
Now, I confess, Kevin Hart came to the faculty after I retired, and so I appreciate your introducing me to books that I need to be reading. Contemplation, all right?
Yeah, he should take you out to coffee. Like that's one of the perks of being alumni in the faculty. Then you don't have to read it. You get the Cliff Notes over coffee from a very wise and kind person.
I like the way you think. He takes me out. Yeah. So
this is wonderful. I really appreciate you putting so much thought in before we got to talk, and hopefully hopefully you can do it again when the new book comes out.
Trip.
Awesome.
Yeah. Stay in touch with me and come by and let me buy you a cup of coffee.